I'm going to talk to you about the relation of physics to the other sciences. If we look out from physics, which of course is the center of the universe, and see what surrounds us, we're going to look out today from physics and see what surrounds us. For physics has a profound effect on all the other sciences, so that students of many fields find themselves studying it. In addition, I'll take this opportunity to explain what the fundamental problems are in the other sciences and how they're getting along with them. So we'll do two things. Now, naturally, all of this is absolutely impossible to do in 45 minutes. So I'm going to apologize from the beginning for the cursory way in which I'm going to deal with the complex, the subtle, and the beautiful matters in the other subjects. I should like also to have dealt with the relation of physics to engineering, industry, society, and war, but I haven't got the time to deal with these things. Why, neither do I have the time to discuss the most remarkable relationship between mathematics and physics. Mathematics is not a science from my point of view. In a sense, it's not a natural science. It's an unnatural science, perhaps. Incidentally, may I say from the beginning that if a thing is not science, it is not necessarily bad. For example, love is not a science. So there's nothing, if something is said not to be a science, that doesn't mean there's something wrong with it. It just means it isn't science. Because science is good, let's say. It doesn't mean that which is not science is not good, if you know how to reason. The science which has perhaps been most deeply affected by physics is the science of chemistry. Historically, the early days of chemistry was a study of what we call now inorganic chemistry, the substances that were found not associated with living things in the rocks and so on. And there was a considerable analysis of it to discover the existence of elements and their relationships to making various relatively simple compounds. The early chemistry was very important for the physics. The interaction was very great right at the beginning because the theory of atoms was substantiated to a large extent by the experiments in chemistry. But the theory of chemistry, that is the reactions themselves, were all summarized to a large extent in the periodic chart of Mendeleev, which showed some strange relationships between the various elements. And it was a collection of rules as to which substances combine with which and how, which constituted the inorganic chemistry. All these rules were ultimately explained in principle by quantum mechanics. That is, the characteristics of the periodic table can be understood from physics by understanding what the atom is, how it's made up of protons and electrons obeying quantum mechanics. So that the theoretical chemistry is in fact physics. On the other hand, this explanation, I say, is in principle. And we've already discussed the difference between knowing the rules of the game of chess and being able to play. And so it is that we may know the rules, but we can't play too well. It turns out to be very difficult to be really able to predict in detail precisely what will happen in a given chemical reaction. But nevertheless, the deepest part of theoretical chemistry must end up in quantum mechanics. There is a branch of physics and chemistry which were developed together by both sciences, which is extremely important, which is called statistical mechanics. And that was involved because in any chemical situation, very large numbers of atoms are involved. And we've seen that the atoms are all jiggling around in a very random manner, in a very complicated way. If we would analyze each collision and be able to follow how every molecule went, of course we could figure out what would happen. But the number of numbers needed to keep track of all these molecules exceeds enormously the capacities of any machines, and certainly before computing machines existed, the capacity of the mind. And therefore, it was important to develop a method of dealing with such complicated situations. And this is the method of statistics applied in the situation in which there are mechanical laws, which is then called statistical mechanics, and was developed by both sciences together. This statistical mechanics is a theory of the phenomena of heat, or thermodynamics. So inorganic chemistry is now almost finished in its main problems, aside from, of course, its industrial applications and so on, but as a science. It is now reduced essentially to what is now called physical chemistry and quantum chemistry. That is, to study the rates at which reactions occur. Do they agree with the principles of statistical mechanics? What essentially is happening in detail? How do the molecules hit? And which pieces fly off first, and so forth. And the quantum chemistry to calculate whether we can understand what happens in terms of the physical laws. The other branch of chemistry is organic chemistry, and that's the chemistry of the substances which are associated with living things. And incidentally, for a while it was believed that the substances which were associated with living things were so marvelous that they could not be made by hand from inorganic materials, but this is not at all true. They're just the same as the substances made by the inorganic chemist, only more complicated arrangements of the atoms are involved. Organic chemistry obviously has a very close relationship to the biology which supplies the substances and to industry. And furthermore, much physical chemistry and quantum chemistry can be applied here too, to organic compounds as well as inorganic compounds. But the main problems of organic chemistry are not there, but rather to analyze and to synthesize and to reproduce the substances which are in the biological systems, in living things. And this leads, as you go into it in more detail, imperceptibly in steps toward biochemistry, and then into biology itself, or molecular biology, and it's very hard to draw the line. I'll come to this subject of biochemistry later. And make it contract. How simple. What makes a muscle contract? A muscle is an awful large number of fibers close together, containing two different substances, myosin and actomycin, or something like that. I don't remember the names. And the machinery by which the chemical reactions which are changed by acetylcholine is able to modify the dimensions of the molecule are not known. In other words, the fundamental processes in the muscle that makes mechanical motion is not known. There are, of course, biology is such an enormously wide field. There's a host of other problems, and I can't mention them at all. Problems like how vision works, what the light does in the eye, how hearing works, for example, and so on. With regard to how thinking works, I'll discuss that later on under psychology. Now, these things that we've just discussed are, from a biological standpoint, really not fundamental or basic or way down in the bottom of all of life, in the sense that if you understood them, you still wouldn't understand life itself, you know? Because, to illustrate, for all the men who are studying nerve and say it's very important, nerves, because after all, you can't have animals without nerves, but you can have life without nerves because the plants have no nerves and they have no muscles, but they're alive just as much. So the fundamental processes of biology, we have to look deeper. And then it's discovered that all living things have some great things in common, and therefore there is a common, deep biological subject, because there is many, many things that are common to all living things. So now I turn to those things which are common to all living things. The most common feature is that they're made of cells. And in the cells is a vast machinery for doing things chemically. In the plant cells, for example, there's a machinery for picking up light and then keep generating sucrose, or energy, and then generating sucrose, which in the dark is then consumed to keep the thing alive. And that generates a series of chemical reactions in a vast and complicated cycle. The phenomena of respiration in animals is extremely closely related to the photosynthesis and its opposite effect in the dark in plants. And so in all the systems, in all the cells, there are these elaborate chemical reactions in which one compound after the other, one compound is changed into another. You can't see it from back there. But to give you some impression of the enormous efforts that have been gone into the study of biochemistry, the chemistry of biological processes, there's some charts here which summarize all the knowledge of today on the series of reactions which occur in cells. Now, these charts are so small scale, I appreciate that you can't make it out at all. And in order to help you out, I've taken one piece of this chart, which is down here. That's just this one piece. And I magnified it so you can see it on the blackboard over here. Now, I don't want you to learn this. You're going to learn this when you study biochemistry, but I want you to get the impression of what is known and the complexities that there are in living things. There are a whole series of chemicals, that a certain molecule that keeps changing in a rather small way. To go from here to here, you simply add an OH and so on. And it goes around a cycle, as you see, called the Krebs cycle, the respiratory cycle. Each one of these steps, each of these chemicals is fairly simple itself. But each one of these steps, and this is the centrally important feature of that's discovered in biochemistry, each one of these steps is relatively difficult to accomplish in a laboratory. If you have the one substance and the other substance, it just doesn't turn from one into the other. It's hard to get it apart. If you have the molecule, if you wanted to add the OH, it takes a certain energy to get it on. although when it's on, it likes to be there. It's something like this. If I wanted to take an object from here to here, it would be okay if I could push it over the top. So most chemical reactions don't occur because there's what's called an activation energy in the way. In order to add the substance to the chemical, requires essentially that you push on and get it close enough so that some rearrangement can occur, and then it'll stick. But if you can't give it enough energy to get it close enough, it won't go. It'll just go up and come back. So most of these reactions don't go because of this. But if you could take those chemicals in your hand, those substances in your hand, and just pull it just back, or open a hole and let the other thing in and let it snap back, or however it is built, then you could find another way around which wouldn't require that, and the reaction could go easily. So there are in the cells very large molecules, enormous things. These are very small molecules that involve perhaps this many atoms, half of this model. But the large molecules, which this is not one, but it may contain more atoms even than that, in some complicated way just comes around this thing and holds it just right so the next reaction can occur. And these very large and complicated things are called enzymes. They were first called ferments because the first discovery of them was in the fermentation of sugar or making wine and so on, that the first ferments were discovered. And the first series of reactions, some of the reactions, in fact, in this very cycle were first discovered there. In the presence of an enzyme, a reaction will go. An enzyme is made out of another substance called protein, which I'll explain in a minute how the enzymes look. But they're very big and complicated, and they control reactions, and every one of them is different. And each one is built to control a certain special reaction. So the names of the enzymes are written here at each reaction. Sometimes the same enzyme may run two reactions, but here they are going around the cycle. These words represent some big lump of stuff that comes in and lets it go from here to here. The enzymes themselves are not involved in a reaction directly. They don't change. They just come and let this go from here to here, and they come back, and they're ready to do it to the next molecule. In other words, it's like a machine, a factory. There's a machine. Thing goes in, boom, boom, comes out. During all this process, there has to be a supply of certain atoms. For example, there may be a removal of hydrogen here and here, or here. And there are special substances which carry complicated enzymes which have a little special unit on it which carries the hydrogen for all the chemical reactions. There are 3 or 4, for example, hydrogen or reducing enzymes which are used all over the cycle in different places. And so what's interesting is that the machinery, for instance, which liberates some hydrogen here, will take that hydrogen and use it somewhere else. In fact, the photosynthetic process is one which transforms this form to that form, and thus it's able to run the cycle. The light is what ultimately does that somewhere else in the cell, and then this substance comes over here, wherever this place is where this happened, and runs that cycle. The most important feature of the cycle is right here, the transform from GDP to G3TP. It used to be called ADP and ATP. Guanidine diphosphate to guanidine triphosphate. It used to be thought to be adenine diphosphate to adenine triphosphate, but it's the same. This is very important because this substance has much more energy in it than this. And just like there's a box for carrying hydrogen atoms around, a special hydrogen atom carrier in living things, there are also special energy-carrying substances which involve the triphosphate group. So this has more energy than that. And if the cycle is going this way, we're generating an energy object. Nor can we really work out the properties of the rocks at high pressure. You can't tell how fast they should give. And so that has all be worked out by experiment. Next, I'll talk about the science of psychology. Incidentally, psychoanalysis is not a science. It's a medical business. It's like witch doctory. It has a theory as to what causes disease. Lots of different spirits and this and that. Let's say the witch doctor has a theory that if the disease is caused by something that comes in through the air, a spirit comes into the air. It's true, something does come into the air, but it's not the same kind of spirit. And it is not gotten rid of, say, by shaking a snake over you, but quinine does help malaria, etc. So if you're sick, I would advise that you go to the witch doctor because he's the man in the tribe who knows the most about the disease. On the other hand, it is not a science. It has not been checked by experiment carefully, and there's no way to You will find no place that will give you a list of the number of cases in which it works and the number of cases in which it doesn't work and so on. The other branches of psychology are perhaps less interesting, which involve things like the physiology of sensation, what happens in the eye, what happens in the brain. One of the most interesting technical problems, which may or may not be called psychology, well, there's things like reflexes and so on. But one of the central problems of the mind, if you will, or the nervous system, is this. If an animal learns something, then he can do something different than he could before. But his cell must be inside different if it's made out of atom. In what way? We do not know where to look or what to look for when something is memorized something. We do not know what it means or what change there is in the nervous system when a fact is learned. And this is a very important problem which has not been solved at all. Assuming, however, that there's some kind of memory thing, the brain is such an enormous mass of interconnecting wires and nerves and interconnections that it probably can't be analyzed in a straightforward manner. Instead, however, there is an analog of this to computing machine and computing machine elements, in which they also have a lot of lines, and they have some kind of an element analogous perhaps to the synapse or connection from one nerve to the other. And so it is a very interesting subject, which I haven't the time to discuss further, the relationship between thinking and computing machines. It must be appreciated that all this subject will tell you very little about the real complexities of ordinary human behavior. It's like a long time before we get to there. It's only we must start much further back. If you can figure out how a dog works, you're going pretty far. You say, oh, but human beings are so different than it. I know, but dogs are so much easier to understand. And nobody knows how dogs work. Now I'd like to mention the limitations of physics to point out that there is a kind of question which exists in many of the sister sciences, which is not in the physics. First, by the way, in order for physics, in a theoretical way, other than making instruments, to be useful, the knowledge of physics to be useful to a science, the science must be able to supply to the physicist a description in a physicist's language of what it is, the object is. If you say, why does a frog jump? The physicist can't say anything. But if you tell me what a frog is, that there's so and so many molecules, there's a nerve running from it, it's different. You see, and so if you tell more or less what the Earth is like, more or less what the stars are made out of, then we can start to figure it out. And in the biological system, in order for physical theory to be of any use,